The lake had always been my sanctuary. My cabin sat on its northern edge, a place my grandfather built with his own hands. The weathered planks carried the scent of pine and smoke from 1,000 fires, and the morning mist rising off the water made it feel like I was living inside a painting. I never thought anyone could take this place away from me, until the HOA moved in. It started subtly. New homeowners bought plots on the south side of the lake, and with them came rules, regulations, and a committee that claimed authority. They said their community guidelines extended across the entire lake. I laughed at the absurdity. This land, this water, had been in my family for generations. Still, I watched warily as their signs went up, telling people where they could park, where they could fish, even where they could swim. By late summer, I received the first letter, an official-looking notice declaring that my cabin was in violation of aesthetic uniformity standards. Apparently, my dark-stained wood and stone chimney didn't meet their approved architectural style. I tossed the letter into the fireplace, thinking it was a bad joke. But it wasn't. The next week, a man in a pressed polo shirt and khakis knocked on my door. He introduced himself as Carl Benson, HOA president, with a smug smile and clipboard in hand. He didn't ask, he told me, that the HOA was moving to bring all properties into compliance. I stood on my porch, mug in hand, letting his words bounce off the stillness of the lake behind me. I could see his reflection rippling on the water's surface. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just a nuisance. This was the beginning of a fight. Carl launched into a practice speech about community values and standards for all residents. His voice was smooth, like a salesman who'd practiced in the mirror one too many times. I didn't interrupt him, not yet. Instead, I let my eyes wander over his neatly pressed clothes, his shiny loafers sinking slightly into the dirt path, his complete discomfort standing anywhere outside of manicured lawns. This cabin will need to be painted in one of the HOA-approved shades, he said, flipping his clipboard. Additionally, your chimney is out of compliance with our structural guidelines. Carl, I said flatly, sipping my coffee, this isn't your land. He gave a thin smile. Actually, by moving into this community, you're automatically subject to our bylaws. I laughed, not a nervous laugh, but the kind that cuts like a blade. My grandfather built this cabin before your community even existed. And more importantly, I pointed past him, toward the glimmering lake. That's my lake. My deed runs across the shoreline, and every drop of water you see, it belongs to me. His smile faltered, but he quickly masked it. Ownership disputes can be clarified in court. Until then, you'll be receiving official fines for noncompliance. I leaned against the porch beam, watching the man shift uncomfortably in the dirt. He didn't understand yet. This wasn't a tract home cul-de-sac. This was wild land, and I was its keeper. As he turned to leave, I noticed him eyeing the dirt lot near the shoreline, the one spot every HOA resident used to park their cars when visiting the lake. He didn't realize it yet, but that little patch of gravel was also mine, and it was about to become my greatest weapon. The parking lot had always been nothing more than an afterthought for me. A gravel patch by the shoreline where fishermen left their trucks and families parked their minivans before swimming in the lake. It wasn't glamorous, but it served its purpose. To the HOA, however, it was essential. Their new homes lined the south ridge, perched like watchtowers over the water. The only way for them to get close to the lake was by walking or driving down to that patch of gravel. Without it, their fancy SUVs would be crammed onto narrow streets. Or worse, left miles away. I knew this because I watched. Every weekend, their cars filled the lot until there was barely room to walk. Families carted coolers, beach chairs, inflatable toys, all of it passing across my property. They didn't think twice about it. So when the second letter arrived, this time stamped in bold red ink, declaring me in violation and threatening further action including eviction, I knew exactly how to respond. I posted signs. Simple wooden boards, staked into the ground. Private property. Parking by permission only. The very next Saturday, I stood by the lake as residents pulled in. One by one, they slowed, reading the signs. Confusion spread. Some parked anyway, pretending not to see. Others hesitated, rolling down windows to ask questions. That's when I stepped forward, arms crossed. Sorry, folks. This lot isn't for public use anymore. You'll need to find somewhere else to park. The ripple of frustration was almost tangible. Parents groaned, kids whined, and drivers argued. But I held my ground, watching Carl arrive from the ridge, his jaw set tight. He hadn't realized until now just how much power I held. Carl stormed across the gravel, his loafers crunching awkwardly. Behind him, half a dozen families lingered by their vehicles, watching with the kind of attention people reserve for a live show. You can't just block access like this, Carl shouted, waving his arms. The community depends on this parking lot. I let him rant for a moment before answering. My voice was calm, even. Carl, this isn't your community. This is my land. You want your people to use it? Then they'll have to ask. Nicely. The murmurs from the residents grew. Some looked embarrassed, others furious. A young father stepped forward, his kids tugging at his arm. Come on, man. We've been parking here for years. And I've let you, I replied. But things have changed since your HOA decided to declare war on me. You think you can find me out of my home? Try evicting me from a place I own. Then you'll have to deal with the fact that I own this, too. I gestured to the lot, the lake, the land stretching beyond their sight. Carl's face darkened. He tried to keep his composure, but his voice cracked with anger. We'll see what the county has to say about this. You can't fight progress. Progress. That was the word he clung to, as if paved sidewalks and beige siding were the peak of civilization. I stared past him, at the shimmering lake and the trees swaying in the breeze. My grandfather had taught me the true meaning of progress, how to preserve what matters, not bury it under regulations. Carl walked back toward his people, jaw tight. The tension in the air thickened. They weren't used to resistance, and they certainly weren't ready for what was coming. That evening, the lake was quieter than it had been in years. Normally, weekends meant laughter echoing across the water, kids splashing, radios blaring. But now, the shoreline was empty. The cars had gone, their drivers grumbling about inconvenience and unfairness. I stood on the porch with a lantern, the glow casting long shadows across the worn boards. The signs stood like sentinels at the edge of the lot, glowing faintly in the fading light. My grandfather's words came back to me. Land isn't just dirt and trees, it's leverage. Treat it right, and it'll protect you when nothing else can. I knew this was only the beginning. Carl wasn't the kind of man to back down quietly. Already, I imagined him drafting letters, calling lawyers, rallying his board. But he underestimated me. He thought I was just a stubborn cabin owner, clinging to outdated ways. He didn't see the bigger picture. Because while he held bylaws and fines, I held deeds and rights. Every inch of the lake, every ripple, every stone on the lot belonged to me. The law wasn't on his side, it was on mine. The crickets started their chorus as the last light drained from the sky. I leaned against the porch beam, staring into the darkness, and I smiled faintly. Let them come. Let them try to evict me. The HOA had no idea what kind of storm they'd stirred up. Carl didn't waste time. By the next weekend, word had spread that the HOA was planning a special emergency meeting. From my porch, I watched the cluster of cars pull up to their suburban clubhouse on the ridge. It wasn't hard to guess what the meeting was about. They weren't used to resistance. Their entire world was built on compliance. Neighbors nodding, signing checks, cutting grass to precise lengths. To them, I was an infection, a threat to their carefully curated illusion of control. And Carl, I could tell, was obsessed with stamping me out. Through binoculars, I saw him pacing at the front of the group, clipboard in hand, his fingers stabbing the air as he ranted. Board members leaned in, some nodding fiercely, others looking uncertain. Their manicured lawns shimmered under the sun, but from where I stood, their world looked brittle, fragile glass waiting to crack. I took another sip of my coffee, amused. They had no idea how deep their mistake ran. Their bylaws didn't touch me. Their power ended at their fences. And every time they schemed, they forgot one critical truth. The lake, the land, the parking lot, all of it answered to me. They struck fast. A crew showed up early Saturday morning with metal posts and a stack of fresh signs. HOA members parking only, The bold black letters declared, "Violators will be towed." I stepped out from the cabin porch and walked toward the lot. The workers barely glanced at me as they hammered steel into my ground, gravel crunching under their boots. My patience wore thin. "You boys know this is private property, right?" I said firmly. One of them shrugged. "We were told by the HOA to install these." I pointed to the cabin. "That's my house. This lot. My deed. You put those signs up, they're coming right back down." The taller one hesitated, but the other smirked. "Take it up with Carl." I crossed my arms and stood there until their hammers stopped. When Carl arrived, clipboard in hand, his smirk was wider than the lake. "This is official business. You don't own the community." I stepped closer, lowering my voice so only he could hear. "But I own this ground, which means those signs come down, or I start charging your people a fee every time they touch a wheel to my gravel." For the first time, Carl blinked. He wasn't prepared for someone who knew the law better than his bylaws. That weekend, the lot turned into a battlefield without a single punch thrown. Families arrived in their shiny SUVs, kids bouncing in the back seats, eager to hit the water. But when they pulled in, the confusion was instant. My sign stood tall and unmistakable: private property, parking by permission only. One after another, drivers slowed, squinting at the boards. Some ignored them, rolling their wheels right over the gravel. Others climbed out, voices rising as they pointed at me. "Hey, we've always parked here," a father snapped, hauling a cooler from his trunk. "Not anymore," I said evenly, arms folded across my chest. "This isn't public land. You want to park here? You ask. Otherwise, find another spot." The murmurs grew into open arguments. Mothers tried to calm their kids, who whined about swimming. A group of teens groaned, dragging their inflatables back into a minivan. Every moment, the tension thickened, the sun glaring down like a spotlight on the drama. And in the middle of it all, Carl emerged. His face was red, his smile tight. He spread his arms like a preacher before his congregation. "Folks, don't let him intimidate you. The HOA is handling this. You're all within your rights." But even as he spoke, I saw the doubt flicker across their faces. Some of them realized the truth. Without this lot, their access to the lake was gone. And the more they realized, the more power shifted away from Carl and toward me. By dusk, the tension had boiled over. The families were gone, their taillights vanishing into the trees, but Carl stayed. He cornered me near the lot, clipboard gripped like a weapon. "You're playing with fire," he hissed. "You think one patch of dirt gives you power over an entire community?" I stepped closer, lantern light catching his face. "It's not just dirt, Carl. It's control. You tried to find me, evict me, bury me in your rules. But all your power ends where this gravel begins." His jaw tightened. For a moment, I thought he might lunge at me. But instead, he pointed the clipboard so hard the paper crinkled. "We'll crush you. The county, the courts, the law, they'll all side with us." I let the silence hang, then smiled faintly. Funny thing about the law, it's written in black and white, just like deeds. And mine says I own this land. Carl's face flushed deeper. He turned on his heel and stormed back toward his SUV, muttering curses under his breath. I knew he wouldn't quit, but each step he took away from me was a step closer to his own downfall. That night, the silence was heavy. No splashing, no radios, no laughter drifting across the lake. Just the hum of crickets and the rustle of pine needles in the breeze. The parking lot was empty, the signs standing like sentries in the moonlight. I leaned on the porch rail, lantern glowing beside me. The still water reflected stars like shards of glass scattered across black velvet. Carl thought he was tightening the noose, but he didn't realize he was the one being cornered. His residents were restless. They wanted access to the lake, and every obstacle made them question his leadership. The HOA's power wasn't built on loyalty, it was built on compliance. And compliance breaks when inconvenience sets in. I breathed in the pine-scented air, calm in the darkness. I knew the storm hadn't peaked yet. The letters, the threats, the anger, it was all building. But I was ready. My grandfather had taught me how to survive storms. This one would be no different. In the shadows across the water, I thought I saw a figure watching, but when I looked again, There was nothing but the trees swaying in the wind. Still, the unease lingered. The HOA was plotting, and the next move would come soon. The sun had barely lifted above the ridge when I spotted them. Carl Benson and two of his closest allies, Mr. Harding and Mrs. Vance. They weren't there for a morning stroll. The way Carl leaned in, whispering urgently with his clipboard tucked under his arm, told me everything. From the porch, I sipped my coffee, letting the steam curl lazily into the cool air as I watched their gestures grow sharper, more desperate. Harding kept glancing toward the lake, then the cabin, as if calculating ownership in his head. Mrs. Vance tapped her phone furiously, probably relaying updates to the HOA group chat. They thought they were plotting in secret, but sound carries over water, and every so often, I caught Carl's voice rising. We have to show him who's in charge. It was almost laughable. They weren't in charge of anything here. Not the lake, not the lot, and certainly not me. Still, there was a tightening in my gut. Men like Carl didn't stop at angry speeches. They'd push harder until something broke. I raised my mug slightly, almost like a toast, and Carl froze mid-sentence. His glare locked on me, lips curling back as if my calmness alone was an insult. For a moment, it was a silent standoff across the gravel lot, the three of them scheming, me on the porch, daring them to try. Then Carl spun on his heel, his loafers grinding against the stones. Today, I heard him mutter, he learns his place. I smiled into my coffee. He had no idea whose place this really was. By mid-morning, Carl marched down the lot like a man on a mission. He carried a hammer in one hand and a massive piece of plywood in the other. Across its face, in bold black letters, was stenciled, "Notice of violation, eviction pending." With theatrical force, he slammed the plywood against a post and drove the first nail in. The hammer's ring echoed across the water. Behind him, a small crowd of residents gathered, families in shorts and polos, arms folded, whispers darting like flies. Carl wanted an audience. I stepped down from the porch, folder of papers tucked neatly under my arm. "Interesting notice, Carl," I called, my voice carrying smoothly across the lot. He ignored me, hammering the last nail with smug determination. Then he turned, brushing his hands dramatically. "You are officially in violation," he declared, voice booming. "The HOA board has voted unanimously to evict you from this property. You failed to maintain community standards. You're trespassing on shared resources." A murmur of agreement rippled through some of the crowd, but not all. I let the silence hang for a moment before opening the folder. The sun caught the embossed seal on the first document, and the sharp glimmer drew every eye. "That's a fascinating claim, Carl," I said evenly. "But perhaps you'd like to explain how an HOA can evict someone from land they don't own." He blinked, faltering just a fraction. I stepped closer, holding the deeds up high. "This cabin, this parking lot, this lake." I swept the folder open, flashing page after page of county-stamped ownership papers. "They're mine, and not even your clipboard can change that." The crowd's whispers shifted. This time, they weren't on his side. I walked past Carl, past his ridiculous plywood sign, and down toward the water where everyone could see. The crowd shuffled after me, curiosity overcoming hesitation. I planted my boots firmly in the dirt, raised the laminated deed overhead, and let the sun bounce off the Gold County seal. "This is the only authority that matters out here," I said, voice cutting through the murmurs. "Filed, recorded, stamped, and notarized. Not a single clause mentions your HOA, your fines, or your phantom community standards." Faces shifted in the sunlight, some confused, others wide with dawning realization. A father in a red polo tugged at his wife's sleeve. A teenager muttered, "Wait, so the lake isn't ours?" Carl shoved forward, fists balled. "He's bluffing. Paperwork doesn't mean anything. The HOA charter grants us jurisdiction." "Wrong," I cut in. I flipped another page, holding it up. "Here's the plat map. Every inch of this lake and the parking lot you've all been using sits under one owner, me. You've been trespassing on my property for years. I've been generous, but don't mistake generosity for weakness." The silence that followed was heavier than stone. Some residents shifted uneasily, clearly processing what this meant. Others looked at Carl like he'd just sold them snake oil. I lowered the documents, letting the truth sink in. The sunlight rippled across the lake behind me, the reflection almost theatrical in its brilliance. In that moment, I wasn't just defending my home. I was reclaiming the balance of power. Carl's face burned crimson. His kingdom was crumbling right in front of him, and all he could do was seethe. It happened fast. 1 second Carl was glaring at me with murderous eyes. The next he lunged, his polished loafers slipping slightly on the gravel as he reached for the papers. Gasps erupted around us. A woman screamed. Children froze mid-step, their laughter replaced with wide-eyed silence. I pivoted, holding the documents high and out of reach. His hands clawed at the air, desperation leaking through his polished exterior. "Give me those," he shouted, voice cracking. I didn't budge. "These aren't yours to take," I said firmly. "Just like this land isn't yours to rule." He stumbled, catching himself awkwardly, and turned to the crowd for support. But what he found were faces recoiling, whispers spreading like wildfire. He had overplayed his hand, and everyone saw it. The board members who'd stood beside him now edged away, unwilling to share in his humiliation. I lowered the documents just enough for him to see the embossed seal again. "This is the law," I said, voice low but carrying. "You can't nail signs, threaten evictions, or bully your neighbors into submission. Out here, you're just another guest." Carl's face contorted, his control shattered. For the first time since this feud began, he looked small, like a man stripped of his costume, exposed under the blazing sun. The crowd's whispers turned into murmurs, and then into something sharper: doubt, frustration, betrayal. The HOA's grip had cracked, and Carl knew it. By the time the sun began to set, the fight was over. Not with signatures or handshakes, but with silence. The residents who had gathered in Carl's shadow now drifted back toward their cars, their conversations hushed, their faces unreadable. I stood on the porch, lantern casting a warm circle of light against the wood, watching them leave. Headlights flickered to life one by one, glowing threads weaving through the lot before vanishing down the road. The air grew still, broken only by the soft lap of water against the shore. Carl didn't move. He sat hunched on a boulder near the lake, clipboard hanging limply from one hand, shoulders sagging under the weight of a kingdom that had collapsed in a single afternoon. His allies were gone, his board was silent, and his audience had turned their backs. All he had left was the echo of his own anger. I let him sit there. There was no need for more words. The documents had spoken. The truth had burned itself into every witness, and his authority had been stripped bare. As the last car pulled away, I lifted the lantern higher, its light glowing in defiance of the darkness creeping over the water. Behind me, the cabin glowed like it belonged to the land itself, solid, immovable, untouchable. Carl finally looked up, his eyes catching the lantern's glow. But there was no challenge left in them, only exhaustion and bitterness. He knew what I knew. This was no longer his fight to win. Still, the air felt charged, unsettled. Defeated men rarely vanish quietly, and I could already feel the storm of his revenge brewing on the horizon. The following morning, I wasted no time. Carl had made his play, and now it was my turn to finish the game. I spread the documents across the porch table: the deed, the plat maps, the tax receipts, even a letter from the county clerk verifying my sole ownership. Every scrap of proof was laid out like weapons ready for war. By mid-morning, a county truck rolled up the dirt road, its logo gleaming under the sun. Out stepped Mr. Ramirez, the zoning officer. He was a no-nonsense man who had dealt with enough HOA disputes to be immune to their posturing. "Got your message," he said, shaking my hand firmly. "Let's settle this." Together we walked down to the lot. Carl was already there, clipboard in hand, trying to rally his followers again. But when Ramirez approached, flashing his badge, the crowd fell silent. Carl sputtered about community rights and charter authority, but every word collapsed under the officer's measured questions. Finally, Ramirez turned to me. "You're the lawful owner. This parking lot and that lake are your private property. The HOA has no authority here." He raised his voice so the entire group could hear. Any future interference will result in legal action against the HOA board. The silence that followed was deafening. Carl's face drained of color. His allies shifted uncomfortably, no longer willing to stand beside him. The truth wasn't just mine anymore. It was official. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to exhale. The tide had turned, and there was no going back. Carl tried to salvage dignity, but it slipped through his hands like water. "This isn't over," he muttered, but his voice carried no power. Families who once nodded at his every word now avoided his gaze, their eyes fixed instead on the officer and the documents in my hand. One by one, they gathered their belongings. Coolers snapped shut, towels were shaken free of sand, folding chairs collapsed. Mothers corralled children into back seats while fathers muttered about being misled and wasting time. Their cars lined up in slow procession, the crunch of tires on gravel punctuating the silence Carl couldn't fill. I watched it unfold from the porch, arms crossed. For weeks, Carl had strutted through this lot as though it were his kingdom. Now he looked like a dethroned king abandoned by his own court. His clipboard dangled uselessly at his side, its pages fluttering in the breeze. Ramirez handed me a signed copy of the enforcement note, stamped and dated. "This should keep them off your back," he said. "If not, call me directly." His truck pulled away, leaving Carl stranded in the shrinking crowd. I almost pitied him. Almost. But then I remembered the threats, the harassment, the sheer arrogance he had wielded without remorse. No, this was justice, plain and simple. As the last SUV pulled out of the lot, Carl finally turned, his eyes locking on me. Hatred simmered there, but beneath it was fear, the kind of fear a man feels when his empire has been stripped bare. He had wanted war. Instead, he got defeat carved in daylight for everyone to see. That evening, I took matters into my own hands. The official paperwork was enough for the county, but I needed something the HOA couldn't ignore. I hauled out a plank of fresh cedar from the shed, set it across the table, and began painting bold black letters across its face. "Private property. Trespassers will be towed." The lantern's glow lit every stroke of the brush. This wasn't just a sign. It was a line drawn in ink, a declaration that the days of tolerance had ended. No more free parking, no more unauthorized picnics, no more trespassing dressed up as community gatherings. As I painted, I thought back on every confrontation, the clipboard threats, the violation notices, the smug sneers. Each memory fueled my strokes, steady and deliberate. This sign wasn't just for Carl. It was for me, for my peace of mind. When the letters dried, I carried the sign down to the edge of the lot and planted it firmly into the soil, driving the stakes deep until it stood unshakable. The fading sun caught the black paint, making the words gleam like iron. I stepped back, arms folded, and let the silence settle. The lake mirrored the fiery sky, the cabin glowed behind me, and the sign stood tall at the lot's entrance. A guardian, a warning, and a promise. Carl could rage, plot, and whisper all he wanted. But from now on, the land would speak louder than him. Word of the defeat spread faster than wildfire. By the next evening, the HOA convened an emergency meeting in the neighborhood cul-de-sac. I didn't attend, I didn't have to. But Emma, one of the younger residents who had always been polite to me, recorded snippets on her phone and sent them over. The footage was chaos. Carl stood at the front, sweating under the glare of porch lights, clipboard trembling in his hands. His voice cracked as he tried to spin the narrative. The county made an error. We were misinformed, but no one bought it. Fathers who'd once followed him blindly now jabbed fingers in his direction, shouting about wasted dues and false promises. Mothers demanded to know why he dragged their families into conflict over land that wasn't theirs. Someone even shouted, "You lied to us." Carl's mask slipped entirely. The polished authority, the puffed chest, the smug grin, it was gone. He looked cornered, his papers slipping from the clipboard, fluttering to the ground like fallen leaves. Emma's video caught the moment perfectly. Carl standing alone, red-faced and stammering, while his neighbors turned on him in unison. It wasn't just a meeting, it was a mutiny. By the end, someone motioned to remove him from the board entirely. The vote wasn't unanimous, but it was close enough to seal his fate. Carl's reign had ended not with triumph, but with shouting, shame, and a scattering of papers in the night. When I finished watching, I leaned back in my chair on the porch, the lake's reflection glowing softly in the dark. I hadn't needed to lift a finger. Carl had undone himself. Morning came quietly, the way it used to before the chaos. The lake shimmered in pale blue, the pines whispered in the breeze, and the cabin felt once again like home instead of a battleground. Smoke drifted lazily from the chimney, carrying the scent of fresh coffee and wood fire. I stepped onto the porch, lantern in hand though the sun was already climbing. My gaze swept across the lot where the new sign stood tall, bold letters catching the light. Below it, only a handful of cars were parked, and each one belonged to a neighbor who had come by last night to ask permission, not assume it. That was the difference. Respect. Carl was gone. Rumors said he'd resigned from the board after the meeting, too humiliated to face his neighbors again. I didn't care where he went. The important thing was that the lake was mine again, not just on paper, but in spirit. I lifted the lantern, letting its glow fade as the sunlight brightened the water. The reflection was clear, unbroken. For the first time in months, peace had settled over the shoreline. This wasn't just about land. It was about standing firm against arrogance, against the idea that control could be seized with a clipboard and threats. The cabin, the lake, the lot, they had outlasted Carl's schemes. So had I. I turned back toward the cabin, the boards creaking softly under my boots, and allowed myself a rare smile. The battle was done. The lake was quiet, and the home I fought for was finally, truly mine. If you enjoyed this intense story, smash that like button and subscribe for more gripping, cinematic tales. Don't forget to hit the bell so you never miss the next thriller. Your support keeps these stories coming.